I was listening to a history-themed podcast produced by my brother and two other middle school history teachers.
In a world where three pudgy history teachers discuss random aspects of history.
This particular episode was part of a series discussing the various amendments of our Bill of Rights. And for this particular one, I'll let you guess which amendment. It was somewhat balanced, but tended to favor gun control arguments more, like how the entirety of the amendment really isn't being paid attention to while ignoring most of the amendment. Insinuations that hunting and target shooting are really the only legitimate reasons for gun ownership, the obligatory disdain for the AR-15, and, among other things, a casual attitude towards a North Carolina law that had been proven in district court to infringe on two constitutional rights. Surprisingly, though, they did mention some good things that I didn't expect them to acknowledge, like how gun ownership is a civil right, how the majority of gun owners aren't mass murderers, that defensive gun uses do happen, and the role guns can play in discouraging tyranny. But I found this statement from my brother to be, well, rather disappointing.
I'm also kind of conflicted about it because I've seen, like Tiananmen Square. Well, I haven't been there, but I've seen documentaries about, student protests and what happens when the government is armed and the people are not. Mm-hmm. And I've seen that can create issues pertaining to other freedoms.
What's the conflict? If you know it's a civil right, a human right even, and you know the bad things that can happen when governments have an absolute monopoly on force, then are you conflicted that more governments don't have more power to control people? A recent article in Reason magazine might help clear things up. For some, anyway. David Kopel set up a contrast between Europe and the United States when it comes to gun-related deaths, much in the same way that gun control folk like to do. He estimated that in the course of the 20th century, America suffered nearly 750,000 more deaths at the hands of gun-wielding private citizens than Europe did. Now, Kopel was very generous in his approach, since he decided to include gun-related homicides that were defensive in nature and police shootings, because, after all, gun homicides are gun homicides, right? But then he takes this number and compares it with the number of Europeans that were killed at the hands of their governments in the 20th century. 87.1 million, using data that the late University of Hawaii professor R.J. Rummel did for his research on what he called democide, or death by government. This number does not include those killed in wars, just those killed by their governments, with Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia being the worst offenders and making up the bulk of this number right here. You know how gun control types like making comparisons between Americans killed by gun violence with those killed in all of our wars? Well, in the 20th century, there were more Europeans killed by governments than those killed in all of Europe's wars during that same period. And it's over 116 times the number of excess gun-related homicides perpetrated by private citizens here in the U.S. during the 20th century. Point being, while individuals are capable of inflicting some damage, it is on a much smaller scale than the mass killings that governments are capable of. Rummel concluded in his research that those who lived in much more authoritarian regimes were at much greater risk than those who lived in liberal democracies. In fact, he considered democracy to be the biggest factor in preventing democide. Again, let me stress that by democracy, I am referring to liberal democracies, more libertarian forms of government, as opposed to those regimes that have been misaptly named, like the German Democratic Republic or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and to a lesser degree, the Democrat Party. Now, while they are nowhere near as bad as East Germany or North Korea, nonetheless, over the years, they have become less and less classically liberal and more inclined to embrace authoritarianism. One of the reasons that liberal democracies are such good vaccines against democide is the decentralization of power. It's diffused among the people, put in their hands, and this is part of that power. As George Orwell said, the totalitarian states can do great things, but there's one thing they cannot do. They cannot give the factory worker a rifle and tell him to take it home and keep it in his bedroom. That rifle, hanging on the wall of the working class flat or laborer's cottage, is the symbol of democracy. It is our job to see that it stays there.
I also think that, if you have an AR-15 and the government has a tank, then I'm not entirely certain what your gun's going to do.
This is really something of a straw man. Now, the moral issues involving bringing the military against your own citizenry aside, if armor has to be brought in, chances are you're dealing with a much bigger problem than just a single man with an AR-15. But having what appears to be the better toys is no guarantee for victory. And our experiences in both Vietnam and Afghanistan suggest that the matter is really a lot more complicated than the simplistic scenario put forth by my brother. Wanting something of an expert opinion on the matter, I consulted with a friend of mine who's also a fan of this page, who served in the Army in the mid to late 80s as a tanker. And what he told me revealed to me that the matter is a lot less cut and dried than even I had suspected. Firstly, he said that tanks, in their element, fighting on the move, are awesome, but they're high maintenance items and are dependent upon vulnerable supply structures, and they can't go everywhere. But he also told me that when tanks are not on the move, they're quite vulnerable. And since tankers are trained to render their tanks unusable so as to not fall into enemy hands, he told me about some rather surprising ways that a person can disable a tank given tools and opportunity. Now, another thing to consider in these discussions regarding the military versus gun owners is the sheer numbers of guns and gun owners as compared to military personnel. We have about 1.3 million active duty personnel in all branches of the military, with an additional 800,000 in reserves and maybe about 450,000 in the National Guard. Now, on the civilian side of things, there are an estimated 600 million privately owned guns in the hands of as many as 140 million gun owners. Of those 140 million, 18.66 have concealed carry licenses, and maybe as many as 20 million people carry a gun in public every day. There are also 50 million privately owned AR-15s and literally trillions of rounds of ammunition. Kentucky Representative Thomas Massey noticed that the number of hunting licenses sold last year was greater than the top 10 biggest armies in the world combined. And all this in a landmass that is literally millions of square miles. It would be quite the feat for any military to try to secure that. And all of this made possible by our constitutionally recognized right to keep and bear arms, helping to keep our free state free.